The jungles of Cambodia hide more than temples. They hide the echoes of kings who ruled the world, not only through sword and stone, but through silence, patience, and the art of unseen war. Beneath the carved faces of Bayon and the endless corridors of Angkor Wat, treaties were whispered in languages few remember, sealed not by ink, but by the sweat of slaves and the cries of soldiers. The Khmer Empire, at its height, stretched like a living god, its hands in the rice fields of Siam, its gaze upon the coasts of Champa, and its heart beating with divine ambition. Yet behind every monument lay politics woven in shadow. Suryavarman II, the builder of Angkor, played his neighbors like chess pieces, while Jayavarman VII rose from defeat to rebuild an empire of both mercy and vengeance. These were not just kings, they were tacticians of the unseen. Theirs was a diplomacy carved in stone and sealed in blood, a history written between lotus petals and blades. Part 1. The Stone Kings and the Silk Emissaries. The dawn of Angkor rises not in silence, but in a chorus of ambition. Mist coils through the jungle like breath over sleeping gods, curling around towers carved with 1,000 serene faces. These faces are not idle art, they are watchful guardians, mirrors of rulers who believed themselves divine. The Khmer Empire, heart of the ancient world, was not born from isolation. It grew from the delicate weave of diplomacy, trade, and blood, spreading its reach through both conquest and courtesy. Beneath the golden banners of Suryavarman II, the empire stretched from the Gulf of Siam to the mountains of Laos, its veins pulsing with rice, bronze, and faith. Yet what kept these distant lands loyal was not only the king's might, but his mastery of the unspoken game between kingdoms. When the Song dynasty's emissaries arrived from the north, their ships glided up the Mekong like silver ghosts. They came bearing silk, porcelain, and the scent of faraway courts. To them, Angkor was a marvel, a city of gods rising from the water. They bowed before the Khmer king not in fear, but in respect. The Chinese chroniclers would later write of an empire rich beyond measure, where the ruler called himself the god who turns the wheel of the world. Yet beneath this reverence, there was calculation. Suryavarman's diplomacy with China was no tribute, it was theater. He sent gifts of ivory, sapphires, and gold, not as submission, but as declaration. The Khmer Empire was equal to the Middle Kingdom. At the same time, to the east, the kingdom of Champa watched with suspicion. The Champa kings of Vijaya had traded both with and against the Khmer for generations. Between them lay a border not drawn by ink, but by shifting rivers and smoldering fields. In peace, they exchanged brides and goods. In anger, they exchanged fire. The Khmer envoys who traveled to Champa carried not only gifts, but veiled warnings. A single word spoken wrongly in a royal court could ignite war. The Champa were seafarers, bold and cunning, their cities scented with sandalwood and salt. The Khmers were builders, steady and patient, carving eternity into stone. Both sought dominance over the same lands, the coastal arteries that fed the spice trade. Thus diplomacy became a performance, a shadow war fought with smiles and scrolls. Suryavarman II understood that diplomacy was an empire's second sword. He studied the song records, the trade routes of Srivijaya, the ceremonies of Dai Viet, and the myths of Champa. He built Angkor Wat not only as a temple for Vishnu, but as a message to the world. The Khmer Empire was heaven on earth, immovable and eternal. The grandeur of the temple itself was diplomacy, its very existence, an act of persuasion to allies and intimidation to rivals. When foreign emissaries arrived, they were led through corridors lined with epic carvings, scenes of celestial battles and earthly triumphs, until they stood before the king himself, seated beneath a parasol of gold. Every wall whispered the same truth. Power is not spoken, it is shown. But behind the marble serenity lay the machinery of negotiation. In the great wooden halls of Angkor Thom, ministers and scribes recorded treaties that bound distant rulers to the Khmer will. Traders from the coast brought rumors of shifting alliances. while monks traveling through Champa carried coded messages hidden within their prayers. Diplomacy was not only for kings, it was a current that flowed through every level of society. The market woman who sold spices to a foreign merchant, the soldier who guarded the frontier, the craftsman carving bas-reliefs of victories, all were pieces of a grand game of influence. The Dai Viet to the north were rising fast, hardened by centuries of struggle against the Chinese. They too sought expansion, pushing southward into Khmer territories. When Khmer envoys traveled to their court, they were received with ceremony, but behind the embroidered banners lay suspicion. The Dai Viet emperors saw the Khmers as both potential partners and dangerous rivals. Thus began a careful distribute, missions, trade delegations, and covert intelligence exchanges, all while armies trained in the background. Angkor sent gifts to Hanoi, while secretly preparing maps for war. The treaties signed in those days glimmered like silk, but beneath their surface was the rough weave of deceit. In the south, the kingdom of Srivijaya, masters of the sea, once controlled the maritime routes of the region. Their envoys, dressed in saffron and adorned with pearls, came to Angkor not as subjects but as equals. Suryavarman received them beneath a canopy of carved lintels, depicting gods riding serpents across the sky. Trade between the two powers flourished, elephants and ivory for spices and gold, but always under the watchful eyes of spies and scribes. Even in peace, Angkor never trusted easily. The empire's prosperity depended on balance. Too much friendship risked dependence, too little risked isolation. The Khmer kings saw diplomacy as divine ritual. In their belief, the universe itself was a kingdom, ruled by the gods through cosmic treaties. Just as Vishnu and Shiva maintained order through balance, so too must the earthly kings. Every offering, every envoy, every festival was part of that cosmic diplomacy. The foreign emissaries who stood in Angkor's courts could not always understand it. They saw gold and glory, but not the deeper game of faith and symbolism. For the Khmers, the act of negotiation was sacred, a mirror of the celestial order. Within Angkor's royal archives, wooden scrolls, inked in Pali and Sanskrit, there were records of agreements with Champa, trade arrangements with China, and pacts of non-aggression with Siam. Some of these treaties endured, others dissolved in fire and betrayal. When the envoys departed, the king's astrologers would read the stars to interpret their fates. An eclipse was seen as a sign of broken promise, a comet as the birth of new conflict. Over time, diplomacy shaped Angkor as much as its wars did. The stone towers of Bayan rose under Jayavarman VII, their faces smiling with both serenity and sorrow. His reign began after years of chaos. Champa's invasion had burned Angkor's heart, and only through careful negotiation and reconstruction could the empire breathe again. Jayavarman learned from his predecessors' failures. He sent monks to China bearing gifts of medicine and knowledge, and welcomed foreign traders into his rebuilt city. Yet he also watched every guest carefully. He knew that even within offerings could hide poisons. The foreign emissaries who came to Angkor often described the city as alive. The air hummed with chanting, the canals shimmered like veins of light, and everywhere the faces of the gods watched. To them, it was paradise. But to the Khmers, it was duty, the eternal maintenance of balance. A king could not only wield power, he had to negotiate its survival among neighbors and gods alike. By the 12th century, the Khmer Empire stood as the dominant power of mainland Southeast Asia. Its diplomacy was as layered as its temple siege corridor, hiding another passage, each promise concealing another motive. Yet even at its peak, the seeds of decline were sown within these very treaties. Peace built on pride is fragile, and alliances born from fear soon turn to betrayal. For now, though the empire glowed in its golden age, a marvel to the world, its kings ruling both the battlefield and the banquet hall, the sword and the scroll alike. In Angkor, the sound of diplomacy was not the murmur of voices, but the distant echo of hammers striking stone. Every temple, every inscription, every treaty was part of one grand narrative, the pursuit of immortality through control. As the sun sank behind the towers, its light sliding down the carved faces of Bion, the envoys prepared their scrolls and gifts for departure. The jungle swallowed their caravans, and the king returned to his meditations beneath the golden parasol. The world beyond Angkor would shift again, rivals rising, empires falling, but for this moment, the Khmer ruled the center of heaven and earth, and their diplomacy, as much as their divinity, kept the world in balance. Part 2. Between Lotus and Blade, Jayavarman's Shadow Pacts. Night descends over Angkor like a velvet curtain pulled across a burning stage. The towers of Bion glimmer under torchlight, their smiling faces split between serenity and menace. The city, once torn by invasion and flame, breathes again, but its pulse is slower, wiser, touched by the scars of betrayal. This is Jayavarman, the seventh's realm, the empire reborn from ashes. Where Suryavarman II ruled through grandeur, Jayavarman rules through resilience. He is both healer and conqueror, a monk king whose prayers hide the iron of strategy. In his time, diplomacy no longer flows like poetry, moves like smoke through cracks, unseen and untrusted. The wars with Champa had left Angkor humbled. The Khmer armies, swift and merciless, had once stormed the capital itself, desecrating temples and scattering relics of gods into the dust. But Jayavarman, thought dead, returned from exile like a storm rising over Tonle Sap. His vengeance was divine and calculated. He rebuilt what was destroyed, yet behind his acts of mercy lay a mind sharpened by betrayal. He understood that no wall, no moat, no army could protect Angkor forever. Only diplomacy, cold, patient, relentless, could hold the empire's borders intact. Jayavarman's envoys were chosen not for their loyalty, but for their silence. They traveled barefoot through forests and flooded plains, carrying offerings and sealed scrolls to foreign courts. To Champa, they brought peace offerings gilded in humility, but inside each gesture lay a warning. To Dai Viet, they sent tributes of jade and elephants, veiled reminders that Angkor's strength was far from broken. And to China's Song Court, they offered medicines and herbs, securing recognition that the Khmer Empire had once again risen among the great civilizations. Every journey was a negotiation with fate itself. In the chambers of Angkor Thom, the king's council gathered under murals of celestial battles. The air was thick with incense and the quiet rustle of parchment. Jayavarman's ministers recorded every foreign responsage phrase, each gesture, each hesitation. The language of diplomacy was delicate. A misplaced metaphor could undo months of peace. When the emissaries returned, their robes carried the scent of distant kingdoms and the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Unlike his predecessor, Jayavarman used faith as his most potent weapon. He sent Buddhist relics as gifts to neighboring rulers, weaving spiritual kinship with political purpose. Where Suryavarman used the gods to display dominance, Jayavarman used them to disarm. Temples became embassies, monks became messengers, and compassion became camouflage. The image of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the god of infinite mercy, was carved on every tower, its calm smile, watching over a kingdom held together by fear and devotion alike. But even mercy could not erase suspicion. The court of Champa viewed Jayavarman's sudden piety as a mask for expansion. Their spies returned from Angkor, whispering of new roads, fortified cities, and mass conscriptions disguised as temple labor. Jayavarman's diplomacy was a paradox. He built hospitals and rest houses across his empire, yet his armies marched behind them, cloaked as pilgrims. The lotus and the blade were one. Within Angkor's archives, treaties were copied and recopied, each line written with the same precision as a sacred chant. The language was ritualized, filled with metaphors of rivers and mountains, invoking divine witness to mortal promises. Yet these were living documents, meant to shift like water. Jayavarman often signed two treaties at once, one public, for foreign eyes, and one secret, for his council alone. To the Dai Viet, he promised non-aggression. To the same Dai Viet, through hidden envoys, he sowed rebellion among their southern tribes. To Champa, he pledged peace, while quietly funding their rivals along the coast. Angkor's diplomacy had become a network of veiled intentions, a spider's web stretching across Southeast Asia, and at its center sat Jayavarman, the silent weaver. The king rarely traveled, but his presence was everywhere, in letters carried by traders, in relics sent with monks, in songs sung by wandering performers that praised his mercy and hinted at his wrath. To his people, he was the living Buddha. To his enemies, he was a shadow behind the sun. Foreign emissaries who visited his court often left bewildered. They found a city rebuilt with impossible speed, where the sick were tended by royal physicians and travelers were fed without charge. Yet beneath the compassion lay calculation. Every guest house, every temple, every canal served not only piety but policy. Roads meant trade, trade meant surveillance, surveillance meant control. Jayavarman's genius was not in conquering land, but in making his empire a necessity to all who touched it. As years passed, the balance of peace began to tremble again. Champa, humiliated by defeat, sought allies among the Siamese to the west. Dai Viet expanded southward, swallowing smaller states once loyal to Angkor. Reports reached Jayavarman of foreign agents stirring unrest near his borders. Yet he did not respond with rage, he responded with gifts. His emissaries arrived bearing gold and elephants, speaking of unity and peace, while quietly measuring the strength of enemy walls. His diplomacy was a war without banners. At night, within the central sanctuary of Bayon, Jayavarman would meditate alone. The moonlight washed over the stone faces, each one bearing his likeness, compassionate, calm, unreadable. In those moments, the king seemed to merge with his city, a being both human and divine, burdened with the weight of survival. He had rebuilt Angkor's glory, but he knew that every empire is a candle before the wind. What diplomacy offered was time to heal, to prepare, to endure. His final years were marked by exhaustion. The empire stretched thin, its provinces restless, its vassals tempted by independence. Still, Jayavarman continued his correspondence with distant courts. His messages carried on river currents and trade ships. The Song Dynasty wrote of a Khmer ruler unmatched in wisdom, a monarch who governed through compassion. They did not see the sleepless nights, the constant calculations, the sacrifices made to keep peace balanced upon a knife's edge. When Jayavarman VII died, the envoys who had once bowed before him sent their condolences wrapped in silk and incense. Yet in their hearts, they knew the balance he had maintained would not last. The Khmer court, without his steady hand, fell into rivalry. Treaties were broken, alliances shifted, and the jungle began its slow reclamation. The diplomacy that once bound kingdoms unraveled into silence. Angkor's temples, once filled with envoys and prayers, became homes for spirits and vines. Still, his legacy endured. In the centuries that followed, traders and travelers from across Asia would whisper of the God King, who built roads instead of walls, who ruled with both the sword and the scroll. His diplomacy had not been flawless, but it had been visionary. He saw what many could not, that empires survive, not by conquest alone, but by the fragile art of coexistence. Today, when the dawn breaks over Bayon's smiling towers, it is easy to forget the fear, the strategy, the invisible hands that once shaped this stone labyrinth. The faces seem peaceful, but they remember. They remember the envoys who came and went, the oaths sworn beneath the banners of gods, the ink that bound kingdoms together before blood tore them apart. In those serene smiles lies the echo of Jayavarman's greatest truth. Peace is never given, only negotiated. As the jungle whispers reclaim the ruins, as roots coil around one's sacred halls, one might still feel the pulse of those ancient treaties beating faintly beneath the earth. The empire may have fallen, but its diplomacy, its delicate balance of faith, fear, and foresight remains. Carved in the very stones, the faces of Angkor watch in silence, their eyes seeing beyond centuries, their smiles carrying secrets no historian can fully translate. For in the story of Jayavarman's shadow pacts lies the eternal rhythm of power itself, the dance between lotus and blade, between mercy and control, between the dream of empire and the truth of impermanence. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.